Hello, it's Miss Ellis. This week we're talking about fall. The first day of autumn is September 22nd. And so this week we're going to be reading The Stranger. It is written and illustrated by Chris Van Allsburg. He is one of my favorite authors and illustrators. So I hope that you enjoy the story as much as I do. As we go through the story, I want you to try to think, who do you think the stranger is? And then we're going to talk about it after the story. The Stranger by Chris Van Allsburg. It was the time of year Farmer Bailey liked best, when summer turned to fall. He whistled as he drove along. A cool breeze blew across his face through the truck's open window. And then it happened. There was a loud thump. Mr. Bailey jammed on his brakes. Oh no, he thought, I've hit a deer. But it wasn't a deer the farmer found lying in the road. It was a man. Mr. Bailey knelt down beside the still figure, fearing the worst. Then suddenly the man opened his eyes. He looked up with terror and jumped to his feet. He tried to run off, lost his balance, and fell down again. He got up again, but this time the farmer took his arm and helped him to the truck. This is Polly. She's going to join us for our story. Mr. Bailey drove home. He helped the stranger inside, where Mrs. Bailey made him comfortable on the parlor sofa. Katie, their daughter, peeked into the room. The man on the sofa was dressed in rough, old leather clothing. She heard her father whisper, "Must be some kind of hermit, sort of fellow who lives alone in the woods." The stranger didn't seem to understand the questions that Mr. Bailey asked him. "I don't think," whispered Miss Bailey, "that he knows how to talk." Mr. Bailey called the doctor, who came and listened to the stranger's heart. He felt his bones and looked in his eyes and took his temperature. He decided the man had lost his memory. There was a bump on the back of his head. "In a few days," the doctor said, "he should remember who he is and where he's from." Mrs. Bailey stopped the doctor as he left the house. He'd forgotten his thermometer. "Oh, you could throw that out," he answered. "It's broken. The mercury is stuck at the bottom." Mr. Bailey lent the stranger some clean clothes. The fellow seemed confused about buttonholes and buttons, and in the evening he joined the Baileys for dinner. The steam that rose from the hot food fascinated him. He watched Katie take a spoonful of soup and blow gently across it. Then he did exactly the same. Miss Bailey shivered. "Brr," she said. "There's a draft in here tonight." The next morning, Katie watched the stranger from her bedroom window. He walked across the yard toward two rabbits. Instead of running into the woods, the rabbits took a hop in his direction. He picked up one of them and stroked his ears, and then set it down. The rabbits hopped away and then stopped and looked back, as if they expected the stranger to follow them. When Katie's father went into the fields that day, the stranger shyly tagged along. Mr. Bailey gave him a pitchfork, and with a little practice, he learned to use it well. They worked hard. Occasionally, Mr. Bailey would have to stop and rest, but the stranger never got tired. He didn't even sweat. That evening, Katie sat with the stranger watching the setting sun. High above them, a flock of geese in a perfect V formation, see up here, flew south on the trip they made every fall. The stranger could not take his eyes off the birds. He stared at them like a man who had been hypnotized. 2 weeks passed, and the stranger still could not remember who he was. But the Baileys didn't mind. They liked having the stranger around. He had become one of the family. Day by day, he had grown less timid. "He seems so happy to be around us," Mr. Bailey said to his wife. "It's hard to believe that he's a hermit." Another week passed. Farmer Bailey could not help noticing how peculiar the weather had become. Not long ago it seemed that autumn was just around the corner. Now it still felt like summer, as if the seasons couldn't change. The warm days made the pumpkins grow larger than ever, and the leaves on the trees were as green as they had been 3 weeks before. One day, the stranger climbed the highest hill on the Bailey farm. He looked to the north and he saw a puzzling sight. The trees in the distance were bright red and orange, but the trees to the south, like those around the Baileys, were nothing but shades of green. They seemed so drab and ugly to the stranger. It would be much better, he thought, if all the trees could be red and orange. The stranger's feelings grew stronger the next day. He couldn't look at the tree's green leaves without sensing that something was terribly wrong. The more he thought about it, the more upset he became, until finally he could think of nothing else. He ran to a tree and pulled off a leaf, and he held it in his trembling hand, and without thinking, he blew on it with all of his might. Can you see what happened to it? When he blew on it, what had happened? Did it turn into orange? At dinner that evening, the stranger appeared dressed in his old leather clothes. By the tears in his eyes, the Baileys could tell that their friend had decided to leave. He hugged them once, and then he dashed out the door. The Baileys hurried outside to wave goodbye, but the stranger had disappeared. The air had turned cold, and the leaves on the trees were no longer green. Every autumn since the stranger's visit, the same thing happens at the Bailey's farm. The trees that surround it stay green for a week after the trees to the north have turned, and then overnight they change their color to the brightest of any tree around. And etched in frost on the farmhouse windows are words that say simply, "See you next fall." I love that story. I think Chris Van Allsburg is a fabulous storyteller. Can you tell who the stranger was? The stranger was Jack Frost. And Jack Frost, there were clues through the story, so let me show you real quick before you go. Jack Frost couldn't change the temperature. And our first clue was when the doctor came and the temperature, he couldn't take his temperature. He thought the thermometer was broken because the mercury was all the way down because Jack Frost was so cold. And when he blew on the warm soup, the wife said that there was a draft in the kitchen that night because it was so cold when he blew across the soup. And the animals all knew who he was because he changes the seasons. And he was a good hard worker because he has to change all of the seasons. And he saw the geese going and he knew that was a symbol for him to do something. And then when he realized everything was changed except for where he was, something was off. And when he picked the leaf off and he touched it and it turned orange, that's when he knew who he was supposed to be. I hope you enjoyed our story. Chris Van Allsburg, we have lots of Chris Van Allsburg books. He's famous for writing Jumanji, he's famous for the Polar Express, and he's famous for a bunch of other stories as well. I hope you check him out. I'll see you next time.